we threw it out to my followers, to the listeners, to see if anyone had a question that they wanted answered that would make sense, right? And I will apologize because I didn't specify, but there were a lot of like start sit kind of questions. We weren't going to address that on the show. I wanted something more general.
Got to specify no start sit. Yeah.
Yeah, we got a lot of those. But yeah, we got a few that were really good, sort of general questions. I'll try to jump back in and answer as many of them as I can on social media. But the one that I wanted to talk about today here is from LouPhil92. And the question is, what's the typical makeup of your bench at this time of year if you're on the cusp of the playoffs? Handcuff running backs for your starters, handcuffs for other manager starters, high upside, low volume players, or more stable assets, maybe even multiple defenses for PS matchups. I'm not sure what the PS there stands
playoff
for.
Schedule.
But for
I'm guessing playoff
schedule. Okay, for play, we'll just playoff matchups. Yeah. So I loved this question, Harmon, and you know me, like I love like game theory stuff and trying to figure out like different ways you can approach and find edges. And I feel like I have a lot to say about this one. I feel like I've talked a lot on the show, so I will apologize, dude, but I'm going to go off again here. I think people should be looking at their bench. Yeah, it really depends. It really depends on where your team's at. If you're a contender versus if you're still fighting for a playoff spot, like there's a few different things that would factor in here. So don't get me wrong. Like, there's just like one approach that's like the be all and end all that you should follow. But I will say like, depending on how your roster's constructed here, I'll give you an example. Like if you have an elite quarterback, if you have an elite tight end, there's really no reason to hold a backup. I know some leagues are deep. People hoard backup quarterbacks or backup tight ends. But if you have an elite player at the position, that should lock down that position for you, right? Versus if you've been streaming at that position, maybe you do want to set aside 2 roster spots and grab a guy and try to get ahead for the next week and do that sort of thing. So that is one thing that you're going to have to factor in. We're almost through bye weeks. So you try to just move past that. Once you get past bye weeks, you don't have to worry as much about those like 1 week fill-in types, right? So if you're in a deep league where people are hoarding all those positions, fine, grab 2 of them. Otherwise, we are 1 quarterback, we are 1 tight end, unless you're in a super flex league. Another example would be if you have 2 or 3 elite receivers, really high-end receivers. You don't need to spend bench spots on other receivers. Why would you do it, right? You have the top guys. If injuries strike, you're going to go to the waiver wire, like I always talk about, and you're going to grab a wide receiver 3 flex option, which there basically are every single week. If you grab someone and hold them on your bench, are they going to be that much more valuable than that? Probably not. So think about ways that you can use the waiver wire as like a tool, right? Use the waiver wire as your bench almost and go and grab like that wide receiver 3 flex play when you need it, but don't carry that guy on your bench. Save that bench spot for somebody with higher upside, right? So, for example, on one of my teams, I have Jamar Chase and I have Rashee Rice and I have Garrett Wilson on IR. I'm just rolling with those guys. Even though Garrett Wilson's on IR, I'm not even picking up another receiver until Chase gets suspended. And I went out and I got Michael Wilson because that week Michael Wilson was available. And I have a guy who I've ranked as like a top 20, top 24 option this week. That's a particularly nice option to be able to slide into your lineup for a week or so. But still, that's the idea that you can go to the waiver wire and get that type of player. So I am, rolling with high-end starters when I have them at positions, and I'm not really spending much on my bench except for running back. That is where, as Lou Phil there said, you want to spend as many spots as possible on backup running backs, on those guys that are 1 injury away, who could just blow up when they get that opportunity. And I mean, you look at it here, like it all leads me to my main point, right? Like that you want to try to get guys on your team that are going to have a huge impact on your roster the rest of the season. You don't want to have bench players that are just like, oh, it's great. I have Demario Douglas. Awesome. I can put him in my lineup this week and he's going to get me 6 to 10 fantasy points. No, you want these backup running backs that when an injury strikes their depth chart, they all of a sudden become top 20, maybe even top 10 fantasy options at their position. And all season long, I've been writing a backup running back column. A lot of the guys are still available in more than 50% of leagues, Harmon. So I want to mention a few of them here as guys that people should be targeting. Bashal Tutin, still available in 61% of leagues, despite everything we just said about him in the last segment there. Bashal Tutin, you can go out and still get him in a lot of spots. Sean Tucker, 51% available. So like right on the cusp there at the cutoff I used for the waiver wire article. And yet a guy that now that it looks Bucky Irving's not going to play this week, a guy that you can grab, have him in case Bucky Irving doesn't come back or gets hurt again at some point, but also a guy you could put in as a potential starter this week. Tyler Algier, 56% available. Brian Robinson Jr., 74% somehow, even though he's behind Christian McCaffrey, who's had quite the injury history, older running back. And if McCaffrey goes down, Brian Robinson Jr. is a top 12 fantasy back, I would say, the rest of the season. Blake Corum, Tank Bigsby, Devin Singletary, if you want to go a little lower. Heck, Chris Rodriguez, he might actually be the starter on his team, even though he's on bye this week. He's available in 85% of leagues. You can go deeper, though. Ray Davis, Ollie Gordon, Keaton Mitchell, who's behind Derrick Henry, who we definitely don't want to see Derrick Henry get hurt, especially with, the December months coming when Derrick Henry normally dominates. But if he went down, Keaton Mitchell would have quite the opportunity in that backfield. So there's just a lot of backups that you can have on your team right now that if the starter goes down, they are very exciting. They are empty your budget kind of pickups on the waiver wire, and you want to have those guys before those injuries happen. So to bring it full circle, totally upside is what we're shooting for every time. You want ceiling outcomes, unless you're dealing with injuries and buys, and then you have to make exceptions. Like I said, with the suspension for Chase, I had to make an exception in that instance. And then, once we get a couple weeks away from the playoffs, because they mentioned defenses, then you can start to stash defenses. A lot can change over the next couple weeks here, right? So don't too far out, go out and grab defenses, in hopes that they're going to make a huge difference for you. I don't think you need to waste the roster spot a month out, but I think a couple weeks before you could start to look at the defensive matchups and who's available. Do not look at stashing a kicker, obviously, because there's always going to be kickers available. So you're not going to go out and get a kicker and put them on your bench. But if you really want to make an impact in your lineup, you really want to give yourself the best chance of finding that difference maker who's going to potentially help you in the fantasy playoffs and in the fantasy championship, you want to roster as many backup running backs as possible. That is always the way to go. And if we're talking about, because I will say one more thing in that question, was should you go for opponents' backups or your backups?
Yeah,
I would normally always say go. Yeah, I was going to say, normally you would always go after just the top guys, the guys that have the biggest upside if an injury occurs. But when we get to this stage of the season, we do have a better view of which players have that opportunity, which guys might be in committees if an injury happens, which guys might be just pure volume plays and get a ton of work and step up that way. So for me, if my roster's set, if I like my flex play, I like my running back plays, I'm probably going to try to back those guys up with their backups. If my flex play is not great, my RB2 is not great, and I need to find another player to get me over the top, then you want to look elsewhere. Then you want to grab the other backup so you can get multiple starters if an injury occurs. That's how I would look at it. It just depends if you're still trying to fill spots in your starting lineup, or if your starting lineup is just awesome, then you back those guys up and you roll the rest of the way.
Number one, incredible analysis. I think you answered Lou's question in incredible depth, which was great. To your point about number one, and by the way, I completely agree. Everything that you said there is exactly how I approach it too. And being cutthroat at wide receiver is difficult for me because there's so many wide receivers I like, but you got to admit that there's a handful of guys that outside of the right matchup, you're just not starting at this point of the year, and they just simply do not belong on your fantasy bench. And I am definitely, I'm usually saving one spot even for like the most of the year to just churn and burn one random backup running back, before it was Kyle Monungai, something like that. Now he's a little bit higher rostered, obviously, because he's had some big weeks, but just on the off chance that, DeAndre Swift misses a week, you've got yourself a starter. This is absolutely the time to be doing that. I love having the other person's backup, so just in case instead of I replaced my starter with a lesser version of himself, I actually might have gained a starter. Also, you're playing defense there too. That's another thing that even if you're stacked at running back, don't look at it like, well, I don't need this guy, because you might be facing somebody in the fantasy playoffs that, they ended up with Sean Tucker as the league winner, and then he dropped one of his 30-point games on your head, and you're out of the postseason when you could have just picked him up yourself. So I agree with that. And my last point here, you got me thinking with all the backup running back talk. At some point, I think Colin said it's in the next, we've got 2 more panic meter pods left. I think once we stop the panic meter, usually we go to the playoff trust meter, which is a whole, for new listeners, we'll get to it. We'll figure it out. I actually think we need to do one episode on just like gauging these backup running backs, bucketing them in sort of trust buckets of, if the starter went down, are we sure they're the backup? So I think that would actually be a helpful segment for people to expand on this topic, because it's one of the things I think about the most this time of the year is which running back could be that guy, the random hero at the end of the season, you know, the quote league winner out of nowhere, the starter goes down. He gives us 2 weeks in the fantasy postseason. Who is that guy? So I think in a couple weeks, Boone, we'll sit down and we'll do a show on that.
I have my backup running back rankings that I do every Tuesday that will lend itself very well to that. Don't have them necessarily in buckets near the top. I have them just as the top 10, but I write up the top 10 every week. And of course it changes week to week. So yeah, I think that is, oh my God. Producer Colin writing his name is Phil Moffa in our show sheet. The diehard Cowboys fan, just diehard Cowboys fan. Yeah, we're not necessarily stashing Phil Moffa right now. We might be stashing Malik Davis, actually, who looks like he's the backup at the moment to Javonte Williams. But yeah, no, that's a very good point there. And I will say, to your point about playing defense, if there's a team in your league that, you know, the number one team, the highest scoring team, they look like a juggernaut, that's the kind of team that you want to go and get the backups to their running backs, so that if that injury happens, all of a sudden that team gets knocked down a few pegs. Whereas if they're holding their backups, they're probably just going to run through everybody the rest of the way. So yeah, that kind of team, if it exists in your league, try to make sure you're getting the backup running backs to their stars, because that could make a huge difference down the stretch if there is some sort of injury.
Okay, perfect. Well, in the meantime, before we do this show where we take Boone's great analysis and I'll ruin it by putting it into stupid, meaningless buckets and hopefully still convey some decent information. In the meantime, make sure you're reading Boone's article on the site to back up running back rankings, because we are reading again in 2025.